Do they ever get over this behavior? Does it go away? These questions were asked on a video discussing an adolescent golden retriever who had bitten one of their family members during an episode of resource guarding. As a certified dog behavior consultant specializing in aggressive behavior and nervous system dysregulation, I'm often asked if aggressive behavior will go away or if the dog will get over it or outgrow it. And I would say no. I wouldn't say that dogs get over aggressive behavior or that aggressive behavior goes away. Same with resource guarding. And that's because both aggression and resource guarding behavior are natural, normal, typical behaviors. Humans are big resource guarders. We are bigger resource guarders than dogs. We invest gajillions of dollars every year nationally in the US on security systems and locks and a multitude of other ways to protect our things. We become aggressive when people try to take our things, our money, our food. In fact, many of us are not very good at sharing even when the situation ethically and morally would indicate that we should indeed share. So it's really normal and expected that dogs might also want to keep control of their resource. They value their food or their sleeping space or access to their person. And if they feel like that resource is going to be taken away from them or their access to that resource is being threatened, they may want to defend their access to that resource. And that's normal. More broadly, aggressive behavior is also typical and normal. It's contextual. There are plenty of situations where it makes a lot of sense to behave aggressively, like when we're being threatened or when someone we care about is being threatened. Or we might behave aggressively when we're in pain or we haven't had enough sleep, or when we've tried really nicely to tell someone to back off many times and they're just not listening. And many of us would agree that those are acceptable places to behave aggressively, or they're at least forgivable places to behave aggressively in the human world. And we can see parallels in the dog world as well. But just because something is typical or normal doesn't mean that it's not a problem, or even that it's not dangerous or unsafe. And certainly, if we're at the point of conflict where a dog is engaging in aggressive behavior toward other people in the house or other animals in the house, we have a problem. Unfortunately, a lot of advice on the internet is very superficial, it's very shallow, and it's directed at simply suppressing the behavior, make the behavior stop. And this can be very reinforcing in the short term and very dangerous in the long term. So we want to avoid approaching the problem of aggressive behavior or resource guarding, and resource guarding can include behaviors that are not aggression. But we want to avoid approaching either resource guarding or aggressive behavior from a suppressive mindset. So we don't want to try to punish or suppress or correct the behavior. It doesn't really matter what we call it. We don't want to approach the behavior from a point of let's stop this behavior, which can sound counterintuitive. But what we really need to do for long-term well-being, long-term success, and for safety is to address the function of the behavior, because behavior is just a symptom. It's data, it's communication. So in the case of resource guarding, we may have a dog who's behaving aggressively because they value their item, and they are afraid or upset or uncertain or frustrated that, let's say, the person is going to take away their access to the item. Let's use the example from the original video where the golden retriever bit the person when they approached his slow feed bowl, which was filled with high value items. The person's approach in this context predicts something negative. Often with resource guarding, at least part of that is that it predicts that the resource is going to be taken away. In some situations, this comes after multiple events of this being true. The person approaches and the item is taken away. And sometimes in those events leading up to the bite, the signs of the attempts of communication, the dog's attempts to say, hey, I don't like that, are missed. So the more subtle signs of resource guarding can be things like weight shifting, or trying to move away with the item, or pausing or freezing, or watching the person out of the corner of their eye. Or we might see things like growling that we might ignore or punish, and the dog gets louder and louder and louder until it can escalate up to a bite. So one of the first things we want to do is say to the dog, you don't have to get that loud. I can hear you down here. We want to make sure that the behavior is not being rehearsed. We don't want that negative association of our approach to get stronger and stronger, and we don't want the dog to continue rehearsing having to yell their uncomfortableness, their fear. We don't want them to have to keep practicing defending their resource at that large level. So we want to set up management around the resource so that the problem doesn't get worse and worse. Then we want to pair our approach to the item with something positive. We want our approach to predict good things. Depending on the context of the situation, it may be that we go with management in the long term. It may be that we work on emotional change. It may be that we simply don't give the dog the item that they resource guard anymore. This is not something I would recommend, obviously, if it's something that's incredibly beneficial to the dog's well-being. But sometimes, the dog guards like this one type of chew, and so you just don't give that type of chew. So it can really depend on what the issue is. What are the specifics? But you can see that it's less about getting rid of the behavior so that it never happens again. And it's more about creating an environment and a relationship and a communication between the individuals so that aggression isn't necessary. It's very much like with people, we might work on conflict resolution skills and emotional intelligence so that we don't have to beat each other up with our fists every time we disagree about something or have a conflict. Same sort of thing here. It doesn't have to get to level 10 because we have the ability to meet everyone's needs down here, in whatever way that might make the most sense for the individual situation. And there's a lot of variety that happens with resource guarding. And so it really can depend a lot on the individual situation in that way. And so I think it's a really important nuance because if we come into the situation, as many pet parents will, saying, gosh, I need this behavior to just totally stop and never happen again, then our mindset is going to be on stopping the behavior. And we're going to just come in kind of with this like hammer nail mentality. And that can actually make the problem much worse instead of coming into the situation able to build this host of skills so that everyone can get their needs met so that things aren't escalating to this level 10. We are not going to be successful getting rid of natural, normal behaviors. It would be very much like saying, I want my child to never have a tantrum again, or I want to never have a fight with my partner. But it doesn't have to be a crisis. It doesn't have to result in a trip for antibiotics to the urgent care. Now, different situations are going to carry different risk. And when you have a dog with a bite history, part of my job as a behavior consultant, or if you're working with a veterinary behaviorist, etc., part of that pet professional's job is to help you assess risk so that as the pet parent, you know what you are living with, and you can decide if that is an acceptable level of risk, because there is inherent risk to living with any animal, but there is an elevated risk in living with an animal with a bite history. And that's going to depend on a lot of different variables, including the frequency of the bites, the number of triggers, the intensity of the bites as we measure them on bite scales. So there are a lot of variables that go into the level of risk assessed and whether or not it is likely that another bite will occur. That's when it can be really, really helpful to connect with an evidence-based professional. But again, it is important to connect with someone who is using evidence-based practices that do not use suppression, punishment, and that are looking at things starting with the root, starting with the function. So even if someone is using positive reinforcement, if they're focused on operant conditioning, that's still going to be missing the mark, and that in itself can be dangerous.